Wow, the historical material you sent over about the Alawite community in Syria, especially during the time of the Ottoman Empire, it's heavy stuff. Paints a pretty bleak picture, to be honest.
It's a long and complicated history, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely complicated. And I think our mission today is to really try and, break it down for everyone, make it easier to understand, especially the impact of this period. We've got sources here talking about religious persecution, economic hardship, even violence. Where do we even begin?
Well, I think a good place to start might be with, well, like you said, the discrimination. The Alawite minority in Syria under Ottoman rule, we're talking like 1516 to 1918. That's a long time.
That's a huge chunk of time. And you specifically wanted to know, what kinds of discrimination did they face and what were the long-term consequences? So, how did this period shape them?
Right, exactly. And, when you dive into this history, what really hits you is how minority groups fight for survival, against this kind of systemic oppression can have repercussions for generations. And the material you've gathered, it really shows the sheer variety of challenges the Alawites faced under Ottoman rule.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a good place to start is that religious persecution, right? The Alawites, they're a heterodox Shia Muslim sect, meaning their beliefs and practices, they differ from mainstream Shia Islam. And that led to a lot of suspicion from the Sunni Ottoman authorities.
Oh yeah, huge suspicion. Because for them, Sunni Islam, that was the official religion.
Right. So, what were some of the more immediate consequences of this religious difference?
Well, that suspicion turned into actual policies. Things designed to put the Alawites at a disadvantage. They tried to force conversions, for example. And then there's the jizya, which was basically a tax they slapped on non-Muslims.
Yeah.
And to top it off, they were totally shut out of any positions of power in the Ottoman government, completely excluded.
It wasn't just official policy, though, was it? I mean, we've got these sources, and they talk about religious decrees, these fatwas that Sunni scholars issued, and these basically declared Alawites as unbelievers, kuffar. That's a powerful word.
Extremely powerful. And, those pronouncements, they didn't just condemn them religiously. They went way beyond that.
So how did these fatwas, how did they really impact the Alawite community? What were the real world consequences?
Well, they had a huge impact on society. By calling Alawites unbelievers, they basically gave a religious justification for discrimination. Suddenly, it was legitimate in the eyes of the Sunni majority. And this created a massive social divide that made the Alawites vulnerable to, pretty much every kind of persecution you can imagine. And this went on for centuries, literally centuries.
It's hard to fathom that kind of sustained prejudice. And, it wasn't just religion. The Alawites, they experienced economic and social marginalization as well, right? They were basically confined to these poor rural areas.
Absolutely. And they had all these restrictions on land ownership, especially in certain regions.
Which meant many were forced into being sharecroppers or tenant farmers. And they had to work for Sunni landlords. It's like a cycle of disadvantage almost.
Exactly. It kept them subordinate. By limiting their access to land and forcing them into basically menial labor, the people in power, the Sunni elites, they made sure that power imbalance stayed in place. And this economic vulnerability just made their social isolation so much worse. They were looked down on by the more well-off Sunni populations, especially in the cities.
So they're trapped in this cycle of poverty and social stigma. And then things seem to ramp up in the 19th century with military conscription, right? Our sources suggest that Alawite men were disproportionately targeted for service in the Ottoman army. Why was that?
Well, it was the 19th century, and the Ottomans, they needed more soldiers.
Yeah.
But sending Alawite men to these far-off battlefronts, it did a couple of things. It weakened their local communities back home, and it also, it made rebellion less likely. And of course, within the army itself, Alawite soldiers, they often faced, horrible treatment. Abuse and discrimination were just part of the deal.
And it's heartbreaking, but our sources also talk about these violent campaigns, these attacks against Alawite villages by Ottoman-backed Sunni militias. Just adds another layer to their vulnerability.
Yeah, it's a really dark chapter. These attacks, they show just how precarious life was for the Alawites under Ottoman rule. They didn't have much protection from the authorities, so they were constantly at risk of these targeted attacks. It just fed their sense of insecurity and that historical grievance that we see even today.
It's like when you're constantly under threat, that feeling of safety, of belonging, it just erodes away, doesn't it? And so, thinking about the long-term effects, it makes sense that this history of oppression, it would create this deep distrust of authority within the Alawite community. How did that distrust shape their political actions later on?
Well, it became a major driving force, especially in the 20th century, after Syria gained independence. Remember, they wanted to protect themselves. They wanted fair representation, that history of being marginalized. They were determined to never let that happen again.
And as our sources show, that drive led to their rise to prominence in Syrian politics. Especially under the Assad regime, it's a huge shift in power dynamics when you think about it.
It really is, and you can see it as a direct result of that long history of persecution. They were determined to secure their future, and to some extent they did. But even today, even with that political power, the sources emphasize that the trauma of that Ottoman period, it lingers. The scars are still there.
So I guess the big takeaway here is that the Ottoman period, it was just brutal for the Alawite minority. They faced discrimination on religious, economic, and social levels. And that experience is woven into their identity. It helps explain their fight for recognition, their fight for survival, and it's still relevant today if we want to understand the complexities of Syrian society.
Absolutely. It's crucial context. And it leads to a question worth pondering. Given this history, this deep distrust that it created, how might a community's relationship with those in power be shaped by that trauma, even after they've achieved a level of political influence? It makes you think, doesn't it? How much does the past influence the present?
It really does. It's a question we all need to consider, not just in the context of Syria, but in any society grappling with a legacy of injustice.
Absolutely. Because understanding history is often the first step towards building a more just and equitable future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, folks, that wraps up our deep dive.
Until next time.
Wow, the historical